Thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to speak about blockchain and open source. We're going to discuss how open source is developed in the context of blockchain, and we'll be discussing it in depth and kind of trying to advising you on what to choose if you decide to develop in open source your code.
As a first question, I'm going to start very lightly because I'm pretty much a newbie in this. So how would you define open source to a newbie like me with simple terms, please?
One thing I would like to specify, I'm a researcher at the University of Neuchâtel on open source hardware. So this is the next generation, if you will, of the open source movement. Now, open source is a paradigm, I will call it. It's anchored in the digital age that we are now being in, where we see that the information in general can be easily shared, modified by anyone. And so there is an evolution in the paradigm that we had at the beginning of the industrial era, in which we needed to concentrate man and capitals and resources and lands to standardize production. Now we see with the digital technologies that it is much easier to decentralize any kind of process, production, innovation, and so on. Open source started in the United States when we saw the first application of intellectual property on softwares, because originally it wasn't the case. They were sharing the sources in the academics and so on in a very natural way without any kind of restriction, if you will. Like you will do for anything. Yeah, you talk to a friend like, hey, have you seen what I developed? Ah, that's cool, I could add that to it. But at a certain point, it has been commodified as an intellectual property right under copyright originally. So the logic behind it is, so copyright, if you probably know that in other sectors, but to give you an example, just when you have a book, for instance, you are the author of a book, you write it, that adds an original content, then you write your name and is the content is original and so on. And a few other requirements, it's going to be protected and you're going to have an exclusivity on that content.
So it's basically saying that you have no copyright anymore when you are in the open source.
No, it's not the same as having no copyright. Like, open source is not having no copyright, otherwise you could call it public domain. Public domain, it's the Wild West, basically. Just you can do anything with that, but also keeping it private. Open source has been an invention that actually is a legal innovation in the first place, that comes from Stallman and the general public license, to say, well, I'm going to use intellectual property rights and apply a license which will guarantee freedoms on that item, on the software, so to speak, in this case. And these freedoms are the freedoms of reviewing it, auditing it, being able to see the code and how it works, also to modify it, to use it, of course, and to distribute it. And what is also very important is not all that is a total freedom, including any commercial uses.
How can I make money if I cannot sell the software that I make?
Just what I would like to add is those freedoms, these are guaranteed in opposition to public domain, in which it is not. In the public domain, you do not have to respect the freedoms of others on the software. In the case of open source, once you have applied an open source license on it, you are guaranteeing the freedoms and nobody can infringe these freedoms. That's one thing. The other important aspect as well, which is very often the case, if not always, is that the author remains the owner and should be credited for the work. In going a bit in your direction, in terms of money, in terms of monetizing this, once you do not lose your authorship, I will call it, on the thing. So what you have created is credentialized to you, which is at minima a promotional aspect of these models, because then you can demonstrate what you are capable of achieving towards the rest of the market, and then they know what kind of competence and expertise you do have, because you are capable of producing this. And this, of course, as such, is already is of economical interest, because promotion is something that is being invested massively. And in this case, just by producing that, you do have the marketing effect at minima, at least due to the fact that you keep the credit on what you've created, which is something that is not the case in the public domain.
It has an economic added value to be granted.
That's one point. Now, That's one point for a very low-key explanation.
In the context of blockchain, we saw those kind of models. We see those communities thriving on works and on code they most of the time did not write. How does it work? How do we go from a business model, an economy based on the fact that, okay, I create a software, I create like a chair, I create like an object and I'll sell it, to this kind of new economy that we see in the blockchain? How does it happen?
One factor, it's not always the case, but one very smart move that has done the general public license and which has been replicated in other licenses, it's also to add another obligation, which is once you improve the core technology, any improvement is also shared under the same free and open source license. I'm going to call it liberal license because this is a word I find more adequate even in English. So you have a cascade effect, a snowballing effect on innovation, but it's also important for many contributors because they know they're not going to be alienated from what they have added to the pool, if you will. So you are more willing to participate when you know that at the end of the day, you're not going to be deprived of using that, or someone else going to add some layers and then privatize it and so on. Okay, so this is a huge trust factor. It's not in all open lib licenses the case, but in the most successful ones, such as the GPL v2, which is used for Linux. Linux is now running virtually most of the servers around the world. It has been a decisive factor to create trust and to let people contribute to that, knowing that they will not be alienated from their creation. Now, next step is in terms of business models, you no longer refer to the product as such, although you could, because you could still make developments on that and be paid for it. That's one thing. If someone wants to improve a common technological commons, if you will, but perhaps you want to tweak it in a specific way, then you may still pay for developers to do that. So that's one service that could be provided, but also the fact that this product is being maintained. If you want to install it, not everybody has the technical knowledge to master software in any case. So you would still like to have specialists that are able to provide you, for instance, with hosting, maintenance, updates, even further development and stuff like that. So all that realm remains, but the logic, it's more that is service-centric rather than product-centric. So that's the huge difference around it.
You reduce your costs actually by having an open source.
Yes, if you apply the right license or you create the right dynamics, this is what's going to happen. On the one hand, you're going to have reduced research and development costs because actually you do have a community that voluntarily then improve the technology and is contributing for free, because there are many reasons for that. It's been well studied, especially in the US or in the Anglo-Saxon world. So you have this contributing factor, which helps for the research and development. And the other aspect is also the marketing, because the people, they do enjoy having these freedoms, and then they will spread the word, basically, because they're like, wow, that's really cool. See, that company, they produce that, and they can share it as well. They can share the code to the other ones. So you are decreasing the cost of R&D and marketing if you applied a well-functioning open source or lib strategy.
Yeah, and we can definitely wonder what would have been the blockchain industry if there were like no possibility to share away. And now we see more and more some protocol being forked, like protocol forking another.
And you can even go further than that. You could say we will not even have the internet as we know it without open source licenses, because you do have some part of the internet which are in the public domain, like HTTP, but also the Apache license, Apache 2.0, has been a revolution in terms of hosting websites and so on. And imagine if you had for each hosting the need to ask for a license to a specific provider, how slow it would have moved forward. But now, by enabling having open standards that give you the capacity actually of hosting websites and so on, and you can create further layers of added value and provide services and have e-commerce platform and so on the top of that. Otherwise, you see how burdensome it will be to pay for each layers to just basically launch a new technology, a new form of service. This is very important, and this is structural, and many do not realize it, but open source is already dominant in the software industry.
Why do you say so? Like the open source? Do you have like example?
But it's a fact. So the Apache, I think it's the Apache protocol. This is the case. The Linux server, to give you a few examples, and you have many also bricks of technology which are needed for interoperability and open standards. Because if everybody is doing their own little kitchen things on their side, then you see how difficult it is to make it interoperating and having common standards that then allow for the development and innovating further. We call it actually the tragedy of the anti-commons, when you have too many exclusivities that deprive then the capacity of acting, because everybody has their own little interest and you have to discuss with each and every actors, and then you may be blocked, or you need massive resources to overcome the disparity of the exclusive rights. That being the case. And just, I've pointed out, but really we have to understand that this is just the paradigm of the digital age. And this is really what has to be understood. And this is why it happened in the first place in the software industry. And then it spread to other sectors. So the first generation, if you will, of the open source movement or paradigm was mainly, if only, in the software industry. But then you've seen some new derivative of that for text and images. For instance, you might know the Creative Commons, and that gave rise, for instance, to Wikipedia, to give you a famous example. And Wikipedia is also an interesting model in that sense, because we see on the one hand, we do have the software wiki, which is an open source software. So you can replicate it, you can host it, you can do whatever you want with it. You could implement that tomorrow. And the content itself of Wikipedia is also open, and you may dispose of it as you would like to. So it means the two bricks, if you will, you could replicate them tomorrow, what we call a fork. So you could fork Wikipedia tomorrow, but it will be still interesting if you think about it, because the CEO, she pays something, that's what I recall, like $500,000 a year. So that's an interesting business model, and they are receiving donation in the hundreds of millions of dollars each year. So that could be interesting in running an organization like that. But you could replicate it tomorrow. So why don't you do it? Well, the thing is, there is still something which remains proprietary and which is actually at the center also of these models. Is the fact that it's the trademark. Wikipedia itself is a trademark which is registered, and you are not entitled to use it and pretend that you are Wikipedia. So tomorrow you might create.
You can be for profit whilst kind of sharing. That's what you mean. Yeah, you can still have a for profit type of objective whilst sharing.
Wikipedia is not a for-profit model, but still, this is an economic activity which is central now also
they
as
can
a
pay
pillar
salary
of the internet right now, as we know it.
Yeah.
But
they're efficient. That's why.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. But what I wanted to point out is just the fact that then you have to build the trust. This is at the center of this service industry. The trust is what matters, and no longer the positions that you have acquired by just having an exclusive right on something, which is basically having rents for something that you may have been the first to do this, but perhaps you were not the most efficient in operating it. But by creating that exclusive right, although you will not be the most efficient, you will still be the one that will collect the money. So in terms of free market, well, this is not optimal. And this is actually a fact which is, I think, stated by the US courts for patents, for instance. They do recognize it as being a monopoly. So we have to admit that intellectual property rights are monopolies, and we know what monopolies do on the free market. So this is something which is by design by the states there, but which is artificially creating less competitive market to a large extent. And in the new era, in the digital age, this is becoming problematic. It might have been useful as it was in the 19th century and perhaps 20s, but the next one. But
the future is in open.
In a way, it already is. It's not
source.
Even the future. Now we will see how far it goes, because the next wave is, for instance, the open source hardware, where now we do have the capacities to decentralize production as well in the industry with the 3D printing and additive manufacturing.
Can we speak about DeFi maybe? When
Sure.
you look at the DeFi ecosystem, I don't know, what do you see with regard to what you see in the open source world and the DeFi? Isn't it like absolutely linked.
So the crypto sphere is a demonstrative model of the open source paradigm as such. And what is interesting as well is the technologies itself, those are technological commons under lib licenses, but then how you use it may create a privatized economy, if you will. But if you're not satisfied with the protocol, it also means that then you can fork it and have another one and looking for a more efficient version of it, which is going to satisfy better the market. So you see that dynamism, and what it has created as well is to create some new financing models. But I guess this is not the main topic of our conversation, and you're going to be discussing that perhaps in the next sessions. But exactly, the decentralized finance is a pure product in terms of practice and spirit of the open source paradigms, because then you have multiple actors that basically can create their own protocol on their side and apply the kind of rules that they would like to. That you can also audit the smart contracts and the source, so you are sure that this is functioning, and it builds trust around those technologies, which is absolutely critical if you are doing some financial exchanges.
So do you believe open source is the only way to go?
I'm not saying it's the only way to go, but this is basically, innovation is a spectrum. And what I see is, if you don't understand open source, you are missing half of the options you have in terms of innovation. And to a massive extent, especially if you're dealing with digital or electronic products or services, you are really missing a huge part of innovation and the current functioning of the economy if you do not understand this paradigm. Then we'll see how it moves further. What I can see, though, is now we see that intellectual property rights are only financial instruments. There are no. This has to be said. Those are no longer instruments for innovation as such, and you can see it from the new development that are either ongoing or requested. Because originally the myth behind it was to say, well, I'm the innovator or I'm the creator, and so I have a right on this to respect my intellectual effort on that. But now what we see, what are the new tendencies, is to say, well, no, we don't even need a human behind it. The artificial intelligence could then create new financial assets that are protected by intellectual property rights. And all the intellectual property rights, they are trusted mostly by huge companies and have very little to do with human endeavors at the end of the day, if you look at it square and fair. So we might see and move further in that tendency, that's for sure. But at the same time, if we are being honest on innovation and also human empowerment, I do believe that open source, yes, is probably one of the most important paths to follow and to understand in any case. However you would like to look at it, you need to understand this paradigm, because it's going to be useful in any kind, in any case, in any business models.
Could you explain what would be the way to go as a beginner, as a developer interested in open source? What would be actually the license we should use, and why maybe Switzerland is also some kind of an added value in this open source ecosystem and in its open source philosophy?
Okay. Well, so this is a very generic question, because as a developer, it depends what you want to do. So if you have if it's an hobbyist project, then you should go for an MIT or GPL license, so you are sure that you're going to share it with others. Now, if you are running a business or you're being a startup, you need a strategy in any case, but it will be the same if you will follow the proprietary path in any case. But in the case of having an open source business strategy, what you will need is a strong trademark, a brand, also a strategy to mobilize the community. So you need to go on the forums and so on and understand what people are looking for, who could be mobilized to participate in the endeavor. I think these are the main aspects. In terms of license, I will recommend going for copyleft licenses. So this effect that if anybody improves the technology, this improvement is also placed under the same license terms as the original one, so you do have this snubbling effect. So the GPL is a good one. I haven't mentioned it, but you also have the European Union public license, the EUPL. It's not broadly used, but the advantage you have, it's in 26 languages, so you could also have it developed in French or in German or whatever, which also replicates more or less the GPL process. So that's a good license to have. And otherwise, you do have the classic MIT license. It does not have this copy left effects, but this is not what you're looking for all the time. And the Apache 2.0 is also a fine one in terms of a permissive license, which does not create the copy left effects, but still is interesting in terms of protecting the freedoms and gathering a community around it.
So just consult your lawyer to see your case.
Well, you might. You don't need. It doesn't need always to be the case, but definitely you will better consult. I will say, to have a strategy for that if you do not understand yourself how it works. And of course, legal matters are one aspect of this thing that have to be dealt with. In terms of Switzerland, I have nothing special to say except that we do have a vivid blockchain ecosystem which already understands how it works. So instead of reinventing the wheel, just follow the trend also and the culture. But I'm really talking to the blockchain industry. The property endeavors have mostly failed in the blockchain domain. So the trend is for open source. So you need to understand and master how it works.
Okay, great. Well, to close everything out, are you more of a big bear or a bull?
I will say you have to accept that there are ups and downs all the time. So I'm more a movement person. Go with the flow and understand that things will go up and things will go down.
Yeah, he's a bear.
It's always a matter of how long you're looking at things.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Quentin, for your time and your highlights. And have a great day.
My pleasure.